So right now, if you go on Google and you type out this question, what are the open questions in science? And you'll come across an article that was written in Science magazine, I believe, in 2008. Things haven't changed since then. The first open question in science is, what is the universe made of? And you would say, well, that's very easy to answer. It's made of force fields and atoms and particles and gravity. And you'd be surprised that that's less than 1% of the universe. The rest is actually invisible. 80% or more, actually about 70% of the universe is a mysterious entity called dark energy. And it's not energy in the usual sense. It's an anti-gravity force that is expanding the space between galaxies faster than the speed of light. And we don't know what it is. That leaves 30% of the universe remaining, of which 27% is another mysterious entity called dark matter. And the reason it's called dark matter, it's invisible. And the reason it's invisible is it's not atomic. So we can only interact with things made of atoms. We are made of atoms. We can only interact with things made of light. And we are also ultimately made of light, photons in electromagnetic fields. But whatever this is, there are many theories about it. Weakly interacting massive particles, or WIMPs as they're called. Nobody's found a WIMP so far, and nobody is likely to find a WIMP because it's not atomic. And so we can't deal with things that are not made of the same stuff as we are. So there's 3% of the universe remaining, and that 3%, most of it is invisible interstellar dust, so we can't see it. That leaves 0.01% of the universe, which is visible and atomic. And that includes 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, and uncountable, possibly habitable planets. Just 60 habitable planets in only the Milky Way galaxy. So there's a problem with that too. Atoms and particles, when they're not being measured, they evolve into waves. And these are unusual waves. They're called waves of possibility. And they exist in a mathematical entity called Hilbert space. Bottom line, we have no idea what the universe is made of. The second open question in science is, what's the biological basis of consciousness? So how does the brain produce consciousness? Now, Jonathan Rosenthal, who introduced me, is a neuroscientist, neurologist. That's his background. And he might be somebody unusual, but most neuroscientists I speak to think that consciousness is produced by the brain in the same way as hydrochloric acid is produced by the stomach, or as bile is produced by the gallbladder. It's a secretion of our neurons, or somehow a secretion of the connectome, the connection between neurons. But there's no way we can explain how action potentials going to the brain through the 5 senses, and that's all that goes to the brain, electrical impulses. What happens in the brain is electrochemistry. How does this conjure up the world? It's like Aladdin's lamp, the brain, you rub it, and there is the world and the physical universe. This is called the hard problem of consciousness. And believe it or not, if you're in neuroscience, you will acknowledge that no one knows how electrical information conjures up a 3-dimensional universe, and including the human body with thoughts and feelings and emotions and reflection and intuition and imagination and creativity and higher vision and transcendence. So I don't believe that science has the answer to either of those questions. What's the universe made of? Or the hard problem of consciousness, how does the brain produce consciousness? So I want to start out by saying that I have a scientific background. I'm a neuroendocrinologist, and I believe that the scientific view of what the universe is made of is wrong, and the scientific view of the brain producing consciousness is incorrect. I'm also a student of yoga, have been a student of yoga for the last 30 years, and I've never missed a day of practice. So I know yoga in its entirety. I'm currently writing a book called Living in the Light, Yoga for Self-Realization. So other than the asanas, I've been practicing to the best of my capacity every day. Yamas, niyamas, yogasana, pranayam, pratyahara, dharana, dhyan, samadhi. And what I know from my personal experience and from my inner conviction and my practice of yoga can be summed up in one or two sentences. The universe is a product of consciousness, number one. Number two, the brain is an experience in consciousness like everything else, like the body. The brain is not a noun, it's a verb. It changes with every experience. And today we know that through neuroplasticity. And the genes are also not nouns, they're verbs, because now we know through epigenetics that every experience changes the activity of genes as well. So with that, I'd like to share with you my insights on what I think is the future of well-being. It comes from the yogic traditions of the world, and also what I think is the nature of reality and how we, Homo sapiens, and yogis in particular, have a solution to the first two open questions in science. The universe is made of consciousness. That means you and I are made of consciousness. That means the brain is made of consciousness. Also means that the Milky Way galaxy and those 2 trillion galaxies that we think are out there, and dark matter and dark energy are all products of consciousness. So with that, I'd like to start showing my slides. So this is my talk, and let's move to the second slide. These are some recent articles that have appeared, which are actually very interesting because they're appearing in science magazines, and they are very pertinent to what I'm sharing with you today. What is reality? Is your body a thinking body? Does the brain produce thought, or does your entire body have self-regulating activity as a result of impulses of intelligence that we could call thought? We think of thought as linguistic thought in the human brain, usually speaking in English with an Indian accent. I want to actually reinforce that that's not really true. Next slide, please. And if you look at the next slide, you see again, new scientists talking about evolution as not being strictly random, but maybe guided by evolution, by consciousness. Here's another headline story. Is the universe itself consciousness? Which is what the yogis say, Brahman and Brahmand. Brahman is cosmic consciousness, Brahmand is the universe. And now another article, the flaw at the heart of reality, why precise mathematical laws can never fully explain the universe. If you've heard of Gödel's theorem, you know what I mean. But let's proceed now to the next slide, which is my 7 pillars of well-being. And I'll go over these very quickly. Sleep, both dream sleep and deep sleep are very important for self-regulation, for homeostasis, for decreasing inflammation. And right now, the current literature suggests that lack of sleep could be the #1 cause of premature death from cardiovascular disease, and lack of good sleep is also responsible for dysbiosis, for hormone dysregulation, for obesity, for metabolic syndrome. So sleep is very important. And I just want to say every night before I sleep, I practice yoga nidra as well. Second, meditation and stress management. And we have data from the Chopra Foundation from a 1-week retreat of meditation, yoga, and stress management, where we were able to publish in peer-reviewed journals a paper that revealed that 1 week of meditation, yoga, stress management, movement, pranayama, which you see on the third slide, um, actually changed gene activity. So all the genes that were responsible for self-regulation went up several fold over baseline, some 17-fold. All the genes that were responsible for dysbiosis, for inflammation, for depression, for Alzheimer's, for cancer, for for chronic illnesses like diabetes, they went down. The level of the enzyme telomerase, which regulates our biological clock, went up by 40%. And this research had as one of our partners, Elizabeth Blackburn, who knew nothing about yoga or meditation. She's a Nobel laureate for having discovered the enzyme telomerase. She was absolutely amazed because telomerase went up by 40%. As far as I know, there's no medication that will do that. And there's nothing that I know in science that will do that. What's the mechanism? It's probably vagal activation, which gets activated through pranayama, through deep breathing, through chanting, through yogasana, and all the practices that we do in yoga. So there is a mechanism, and it involves the microbiome, it involves epigenetics, it involves neuroplasticity, but there's no doubt at all. And our study was published in Nature Translational Psychiatry, but there are many other studies now have replicated more or less what I'm saying to you right now, that movement, yoga, pranayama, deep breathing, chanting, and vagal stimulation all counter the effects of sympathetic overdrive, which is the #1 cause of distress in the world right now. Even people who are getting COVID infections and morbidity and mortality have sympathetic overdrive and what are called cytokine storms. So yoga, obviously, and breathing and pranayama and chanting all help counteract that. The fourth thing you see is emotions. And when I talk about emotional and social intelligence, I start with the yamas and the niyamas. The yamas are about the first limb of yoga, and they're about social intelligence. And the niyamas are the second limb of yoga, which is about intelligence, which we call emotional intelligence. So we now know that emotions also affect, and emotional resilience is part of what we teach in yoga. The fifth slide that you see here is nutrition and nourishment. And it's become very obvious that a diet that is plant-based, that has maximum diversity of plant-based foods, has the highest concentration of phytochemicals derived directly from the energy of the sun, that these influence everything from microbial activity in the microbiome to the two-way traffic between the brain and the gut, that 80% of serotonin in the body is actually produced in the gut. So diet becomes a very important component. And as far as I know, most yogis do practice a predominantly plant-based diet with maximum diversity. The sixth pillar of well-being is biological rhythms, which we usually understand as circadian rhythms. And so anyone who's experienced jet lag knows what disruption of circadian rhythm is. But yoga and Ayurveda recognize 4 rhythms: circadian rhythms, seasonal rhythms, lunar rhythms, and gravitational rhythms. They're all part of one symphony of the universe. Our body is part of that symphony. That's why we call it the universe, one song. And yogic practices also allow us to reground ourselves and restore biological rhythms. The 7th pillar is spiritual practice, which to me is the 8 limbs of yoga: yama, niyama, asana, which literally means seat of awareness, pranayama, the various techniques of controlled breathing, and then dharana, meditation, or dharana, focused awareness, dhyan, meditation, and samadhi, transcendence. If we follow these 7 pillars of well-being, we get a very clear understanding of the two basic tenets I proposed in the beginning of this lecture. The universe is made of consciousness, and you and the universe are consciousness. And in fact, in every moment of experience, we structure, as humans, human consciousness, we structure what we call everyday reality. So let me share with you the next few slides to complete this. So what is the direct method and how do we understand it? Direct method says our experience of reality begins in awareness with this acronym called SIFT. SIFT stands for sensations, sense perceptions. S stands for sensations, sense perceptions, sound, touch, sight, taste, and smell. Images, which means our own ability to imagine things, feeling, emotions, and thoughts. When we give meaning to these sensations, basically they're all sensations appearing on the screen of consciousness, that giving meaning to this direct experience of sensation, we generate what we call perceptions. And then, of course, perceptions, how we interpret them, also create feelings and thoughts. Direct visual experience is only color, shape, and form. If I asked you, what are you looking at right now? You'd say a hand, but that's a perceptual construct. A baby has no idea that this is a hand. All it sees is a color, a shape, a form, and the difference between this and this is color. Okay, so direct visual experience is color, shape, and form, and that's all there is. Direct experience of auditory experience is sound. When we give it meaning, it becomes poetry, it becomes language, it becomes music. Direct tactile experience is sensation. When we give it meaning, it becomes texture, hardness, softness, hard, soft, angular, etc. Gustatory experience, direct experience is flavor. Give it meaning, it becomes taste. And some like it and some don't. So it's basically a learned phenomenon. Same thing with olfactory experience. If you study the yogic tradition, you will realize everything that we call physical matter is actually a symbolic representation of meaning given to direct experience. Next slide. Okay, so all perception is a learned phenomenon. We learn to perceive. A baby learns to perceive through language. Okay. Even animals learn to perceive by watching other animals, and something called, neural integration between observer and observed. And when we give meaning to perception and interpret it, it also gives rise to thoughts and feelings and emotions. Next slide, please. So giving meaning to sensations, creating perceptions results in the generation of emotions and thoughts. And the storyline created by emotions and thoughts is the creation of everyday reality that we call mind, body, and the world. If you start to look at yogic literature, you read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, first chapter, second verse. First verse is, now the teaching of yoga begins. But then the second verse in yoga is Chit Vritti Nirodh. Yoga is the settling down of vrittis, which are the fluctuations of consciousness, which I've just now called sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. When they settle down, we enter the realm of pure consciousness, which is the field of infinite possibilities. And from there, we construct our reality. Unfortunately, we are bamboozled by social constructs that are very difficult to get rid of because they've existed for thousands of years, ever since humans learned to give meaning to perceptions and create stories. So what we call the physical world, the physical body, is a story projected by the conditioned mind. Next slide, please. Body, mind, and world are human constructs and therefore illusions. Now, this is not only the yogic position, but also the Vedantic position, also the Buddhist position, and also some Western philosophers. So the Buddha said, our life is a dream. No, the Buddha said something different. He said, this lifetime of ours is transient as autumn clouds. To watch the birth and death of beings is like looking at the movements of a dance. A lifetime is like a flash of lightning in the sky rushing by down a steep mountain, like a torrent. The German philosopher Wittgenstein said, our life is a dream. We are asleep, but once in a while, we wake up enough to know that we are dreaming. And what do we wake up to? We wake up to reality, which is consciousness. And that's the exact position that yoga takes as well. Next slide, please. Of course, we can always upgrade the dream. Illusions are mistaken for reality until we understand the trick behind the illusions. And therefore, every perception is a magical lie. My perception tells me the earth is flat. Nobody believes that anymore. My perception tells me that the ground I'm standing on is stationary, and I know it's spinning at dizzying speeds and hurtling through space at thousands of miles an hour. Perception tells me your body is solid, and I know it's proportionately as void as intergalactic space. So what is this emptiness from where we all come? Is it just a void, or could it be the womb of creation? Yoga shows us the way. Next slide, please. So once we know that the trick behind the web of magical lies and how it's done, we can change our personal and collective reality and know what the real reality is. And there's nothing other than yoga that can help us do that. Next slide, please. So freedom to create everyday reality consciously is a means to alleviate suffering. It's a means to go beyond the freedom, beyond the fear of death, and it is to know ourselves as timeless beings. And with that comes the emergence of Platonic values: truth, goodness, beauty, love, compassion, joy, bliss, harmony, insight, creativity, and essentially the yamas and the niyamas of yogic practice. Next slide, please. So now I'll go to a little deeper understanding of what is reality as science is beginning to understand it. One is quantum entanglement, that every force field and particle is inseparable in its activity from every force field and particle. Qualia entanglement means that qualities of experience are also entangled within species. Meaning entanglement, we give meaning to experience. And ultimately, what our body is the metabolism of experience, which is what epigenetics is showing us. Next slide, please. Now, the same thing holds true for auditory, tactile, taste, and smell, and the entire confederation of perceptual activity, which is a very narrow bandwidth of human perception, maybe very small bandwidth of human perception. The human eye can only see between 300 and 800 nanometers. And yet we know now through technology, there's a whole range of experience available beyond that. But that's our world. Human perception, given meaning, which we call body, mind, and universe. Next slide. I just want to show you some very interesting slides that will, I hope, convince you that physical reality is a construct in human awareness, and that perceptual activity is specific to every species and culture, but shared experience is the overlap of bandwidths of experience with other people and also with other species. Next slide, please. Okay, now just for a little bit of entertainment. This is a bunch of colors, but you can choose to see a woman at a drawer or a skull. Once you give meaning to a bunch of colors, it becomes a perception. And then how you like it or dislike it becomes an emotion, and that becomes a thought. Next slide. You can choose to look at two people looking at each other, or there's a jar. Which one is it? It's neither. It's a bunch of colors. That's the direct experience, but humans can create meaning out of that. Next slide, please. You see a woman's face, or you see a man playing a bugle. It's up to you. Next slide. And now it's getting more interesting. Do you see the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, the father-in-law? Just a bunch of colors given meaning. That's perception. And then how you interpret that, you can fall in love with the daughter-in-law, you can dislike the mother-in-law, and you can be afraid of the father-in-law. It's your choice. Next slide, please. And now it's get even more interesting. These you can see a Mexican on a horse with a person on the sidewalk, or just an old guy with a beard. But it's neither. It's fluctuations of consciousness that we call seeing that create colors and shapes, and then we construct the rest of it. Next slide, please. These are all vrittis in consciousness. Chit vritti nirod, remember. So is this a flower or is the face of a girl and a butterfly? Choose. Next. Same thing. Birds alighting on a tree, a nest with chicks, or just a girl's face. Next slide, please. You can see a woman with beautiful locks of hair, or a mountain with a skyscape behind, mountains and sky. Next. Same thing here. You can see a young girl, or you can see an old woman. Next slide. I like this because it's inspired a quote from William Blake, who said, "We are led to believe a lie when we see with and not through the eye, that was born in a night to perish in a night, while the soul slept in beams of light." So what does yoga teach us? Go beyond the lie of perception to the source of perception. Chit vritti nirod. Next slide, please. I think this is my last two slides here anyway. The face that you see does not exist, and the animals that you see do not exist. All constructed in human consciousness. Next. Once again, this is a very wonderful prize painting. Look carefully. The face that appears is not in the picture, but those animals that appear and the tree are also not in the picture, nor is the mountain and the sky beyond. All constructed, conceived, governed, and coming into existence in our own consciousness. So next slide. I would like to sum up my talk that the real matrix is pure consciousness. And pure consciousness is a field of infinite possibilities, field of infinite creativity, a field of infinite entanglement and correlation, a field of vrittis, of fluctuations that appear as sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, and that you and the universe are one. You is Brahman, Atman, Jiva, and the universe is Brahmand. Practice yoga and you'll discover yourself. And when you discover yourself, you will realize that you're not a human being in space-time and causality. You're actually a formless consciousness that can choose to create reality, that you are entangled with all that exists, and from that emerges love, compassion, joy, equanimity, and that you, as part of the matrix, are not in time, and there is no death, and there is no birth. All human constructs. This is the message of yoga. And next slide. This is Metahuman, the yogi. Non-reactive, always pausing before reacting, developing the spiritual qualities of kindness, love, compassion, gratitude, non-judgment of yourself and others, interoception, which is the modern word for pratyahara, going inward and knowing everything that's happening in your body, part of our training, transcendence, yog chit priti nirod, metacognition, being a witness to inner and outer reality, knowing that they're both yours. Next. These are some of the milestones, and some of this has been published in peer-reviewed journals. So science recognizes waking, dream, and deep sleep as states of consciousness. But there's something called turiya that yoga recognizes, knowing yourself as formless consciousness, cosmic consciousness, which is being in the world and not of it, being fully aware in waking, dreaming, and sleeping, divine consciousness, that potential exists in everyone, and unity consciousness, freedom from suffering, and the ability to create our own reality. Next slide. This is meta-reality, pure consciousness, infinite possibilities, formless, unpredictable, infinitely creative, synchronistic, the source of attention and intention, which is the vrittis, sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. Without modifications, the basis of all experience, self-organizing, self-regulating, self-evolving, rooted in the knowledge of I am. Aham, aham brahmasmi. I am the universe. Tattvamasi. You are that, all this is that, that alone is. Next slide. Metahuman plus meta-reality enter the new metaverse, the lokas that yoga describes, not the metaverse that, what Facebook is talking about. Next slide, please. We've been measuring these milestones now for a time, and we find there's a shift in self from me to we to oneness, a shift in emotions from fear to love, a shift in cognition, quieter mind, a shift in perception, knowing that we are creating our perception, a shift in memory, not victimized by memory, but using memory for creativity, inner vision, insight, intuition, vision, creativity, flow, transcendence, loss of the fear of death. I offer you a new formula. 0 is equal to infinity is equal to 1. Next slide, please. And that's it. This is the source of infinite abundance. I have written a new book called Abundance, The Inner Path to Yoga. And it is based on this idea that yoga gives us abundance at all levels, all the 7 chakras, if you want. The 7 chakras are centers of consciousness. And my book was inspired by a quote from Bob Marley. He said, "Some people are so poor, all they have is money." With that, I'd like to end my talk. And Dr. Rosenthal, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
That was wonderful. I loved your use of illusions to illustrate that. I think illusions really emphasize a lot of the functions of, our perception and how it differs from reality. So that was really interesting. Thank you. I do have some questions. These are fielded from the audience to be. And I want to be respectful of your time. I don't want to take too much of your time. So at any point, feel free to cut me off. One of them, the first one, I think is a nice personal question. How did you first get into yoga? And what does your current yoga practice look like? And how do you fit it in while being such a productive and busy person?
I believe in the philosophy of yoga, do less and accomplish more, and ultimately do nothing and accomplish everything. So I practice 2 hours of yoga every day. I meditate every day. And then I write whatever comes to mind. I also practice yoga nidra, ask myself questions, and in the morning I have a download. So I just write. And I have no intended outcome. I'm a karma yogi, so you do what needs to be done, leave the rest to the divine.
Straight from the Bhagavad Gita. How do you conceptualize age?
I think there's chronological age, there's biological age, there's psychological age, and there's spiritual age. So I'm 75 chronologically, I'm less than 40 biologically, psychologically I'm 18, and spiritually I'm timeless.
I love that. And what does the scientific research currently say about the effects of yoga and mindfulness practices on aging?
Well, I just mentioned in my talk, telomerase goes up by 40%. So mindfulness and practice of yoga obviously work through vagal stimulation, which overrides sympathetic overstimulation. And that's the scientific explanation. But there's no question in my mind that human aging is flexible and that yoga is the key.
And this one I think is very interesting to ask you. What are the limitations of science when it comes to studying yoga and spiritual practices, and how can these be addressed in the future?
Yeah, so the limitation of science is only about what's there. In fact, what's there is perception and human perception, species-specific perception. And yet science is based on what we call realism. Realism means that the world is real. And moreover, science is based on naive realism, which is called scientific realism, which means only the human perception is accurate in giving us reality. So therefore, science is a model which works. It creates technology. We're using science to speak to each other. We travel in jet planes and we say, well, this works, so it must be true. It only works in changing or upgrading the illusion, but also downgrading the illusion. Nuclear bombs, climate change, war, terrorism, cyber hacking, extinction of species. So science, of course, is neutral, but human consciousness can be divine and diabolic. The next step of science is not to just question naive realism, but to also ask the question, who is it that wants to know? Who is the observer? I go to scientific conferences and I say, who's the observer? And they point here. But there's no observer. There's no little Deepak in the head looking at the world through these eyes. In fact, Deepak is an experience in consciousness too. So science needs an upgrade.
One of my favorite expressions is all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think
that's beautiful. That's all models are wrong, but some are useful. That's and you know that the progress of science depends on what we call falsifiability. And every model has been proved to be wrong so far or incomplete.
Exactly. This one is very interesting and it always comes up. I think to me personally, it's unanswerable, but I would love your take on it. So what are the necessary and sufficient components of yoga to have the desired effects on health or well-being or whatever we're discussing? So to be more specific, are the asana, pranayama, meditation, kirtan, kriyas, yoga nidra, yama, niyama, which parts are necessary and sufficient?
I think they're all complementary and they work together and they're entangled. That was what I was meaning by qualia entanglement. So if you're a real yogi, a true yogi, pay attention to all of them.
And people often ask a variation of that question, something along the lines of, if someone could only do one practice of yoga, they only have 10 minutes a day, what should it be?
Stop doing yoga and go make money and get stressed out. And then ask yourself at the end of your life, was your life joyful? You know, what is the point of life if you don't have joy? And that's the first principle in yoga, is that life begins in bliss, should be in bliss, and should end in bliss. And that is called Sat Chit Ananda. And if you have that question, if I have only 10 minutes, then don't do yoga. Go make money and be miserable.
Wow. I like that beautiful answer. And where do you see the future of scientific research on yoga going right now? Like, how are advances in technology like neuroimaging or other tools going to advance science?
All those tools are going to be very good for both science and for yoga, and also changing the paradigm of what science should be. Science should be about observer, process of observation, and that which is observed. Right now, it is only about the observed, not even about the process, and forget the observer.
Very interesting. Those are all my questions. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really respect all of your contributions to the world, and for you to be able to contribute to this conference means a lot to me. So thank you.